Shri N. Ram, other distinguished members of the podium, ladies and gentlemen, friends. I must confess to being somewhat startled at this invitation to deliver the Pinkham Memorial Lecture at the Asian College of Journalism, because I do not belong to the journalist profession, and as a politician, I'm in fact the target of Indian journalism. So it is like inviting the enemy at the gates to become the enemy within. And it is in this light that I come before you to talk rather egotistically, I must confess, about the media and I, with which I've had a rather hostile relationship for the better part of 40 years, indeed for the better part of 60 years, if I were to go back to my first appearance in a newspaper in an individual capacity. I had appeared as one of those who'd passed the exam in Delhi University sometime earlier, but it was at the time that I went up to Cambridge, which was the year 1961, that things started heating up. Because 1961 was perhaps the freezing point of the Cold War. In 1956, on the 18th of November, Nikita Khrushchev had announced to the capitalist world, "We shall bury you." And a few years later, on the 12th of October 1960, he took off his shoe and banged it in the United Nations Security Council. So all this meant that the West was seeing communism at its most barbaric, while Khrushchev was seeing capitalism as something that the socialist world was determined to bury. In this high tension, the Berlin Wall started being built on the 13th of August, 1961. And then, as I set sail from Bombay in a ship that was moving through the Indian Ocean and up the Suez Canal and into the Mediterranean Sea, news came on board that Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations, had had his plane shot down in what was then called Northern Rhodesia, near a little town called Ndola. And evidence has since been piling up that the plane did not fall of its own accord, that it was in all probability shot down by an unidentified enemy, but the story was heavily covered up by the Americans and the British, with the British consul in Ndola playing a pretty significant role in not letting the story be told. And the opposition to Hammarskjöld came from mining interests, Western mining interests, particularly Belgian interests, and to some extent British and American interests, who opposed Operation Mothball that Hammarskjöld himself had launched on his own initiative to prevent Moise Tshombe from bringing about the secession of Katanga. So it was in this atmosphere of high tension between the West and the East, at what probably could be described as the freezing point of the Cold War, that I arrived on the 8th of October 1961 at Cambridge. And there was a huge battle shaping up at the Cambridge Union between an American who was due to become a well-known barrister called Barry Alvin Brown, and the son of Harry Pollitt, the Stalin of the British Communist Party, who was himself a dedicated and extremely articulate communist. The battle took place in December 1961 to unprecedented media attention, the American Alvin Brown won. Then it was discovered that he had been signing chits for beer in the buttery of St. John's College, which is the college located most close to the Union, and a disproportionate number of John's votes had been delivered in the last half hour before closing. So the protocol decided, that is the university proctors and so forth, that Alvin Brown had been bribing voters to vote for him, and so his election was declared null and void. As a result of which, Brian Pollitt then proved that he was more an Englishman than a communist by declining to stand in the runoff election. But at the end of the academic year, when it was clear that he was going to be standing again, and the chances were that he would win, a group of right-wing students who were never identified barged into his room, because at Cambridge we had an expression, sporting the oak. You only closed the door if you were lucky enough to get a girl into the room. And that was called sporting the oak. So since Brian Pollitt was not at that moment sporting the oak, the door was open. These people came and beat him up so badly that he had to have an amanuensis to appear in his final exam. And in these dramatic circumstances, Brian was elected president, and I, in his wake, was elected as a well-known leftist to the executive committee of the union, and that is when my first encounter with the press occurred. Next morning, I found myself described in the London Times as a young Pakistani radical. Since then, my skepticism about the profession of journalism has only grown. I found myself in the Foreign Service with great difficulty because one of the most well-known denizens of Chennai city, I don't see him in the audience, but he was the junior desk officer in the Intelligence Bureau, and he picked up a document from BIS which clearly said that I was a member of the Communist Party. Years later, when he was a very distinguished governor, and I'm not referring to Gopal Gandhi, but one of those who preceded or succeeded him in Kolkata, I asked him, what does BIS stand for? And he said, the British Intelligence Service, of course. And I cleared my throat and said, I'm sorry, it stands for the British Information Service. And therefore they picked up some squalid news item from somewhere. But nevertheless, I received a telegram saying I had been rejected from all services. So that's when the press decided to do me down. It took me months to eventually persuade the government of India that I was indeed a Marxist, but of the Groucho variety. And so they did let me in. And I'm proud to say that as a minister, I succeeded in accessing my own papers and found there an entry which read, I speak from memory, but it's a clear memory, which says, I agree. I too have heard good reports of Shankar Aiyar. He may be taken into the Indian Foreign Service and sent to Missouri for his training. Signed, Jawaharlal Nehru, 23 October 1963. So I'm the only one who was taken into the Foreign Service at Prime Minister Nehru's personal behest, and for that perhaps I ought to forgive the press for having described me as a young Pakistani radical. Anyway, my encounters with the press continued through my diplomatic career. I think the most interesting was a very anti-Indian journalist whom I went to see in Brussels in my first posting. And then he asked me whether I'd like to see some photographs. So I said yes. And he showed me several photographs of his girlfriend naked. And because I expressed my immediate admiration for his taste, I converted him from being anti-Indian into becoming anti-Pakistan. in the year 1965. There are ways to get around journalists. Then I arrived in Hanoi in 1968-69, literally on the day that Lyndon Johnson, for political reasons of his own, designed to enable Hubert Humphrey to succeed him, declared a total bombing halt over Vietnam. Now, the Vietnamese press was perhaps the easiest one to deal with, for there was only one newspaper. It was cyclo-styled, and it came out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it was called Vietnam News. And the first job I did on arrival in Hanoi, and I could do it because I was the first diplomat that the Americans had not attempted to kill, there being a complete bombing halt over the city. I discovered that as between the English and the French versions of Ho Chi Minh's first statement, his first reaction to Lyndon Johnson declaring this complete bombing halt, was to issue a statement in English. And then the French translation followed. This surprised me because I thought Ho Chi Minh was a French speaker, and so it would be the French statement first. Anyway, I compared the two because my French is quite fluent. And I found it was an exact translation, except that in the English version, in the French version, there was one sentence that was underlined that hadn't been underlined in the earlier English version. And that was the sentence which, when translated, read, "We shall fight on until the last aggressor has been swept from our soil." Then the talks began in Paris. And when, inevitably, I was contacted by the CIA in Bangkok, and I decided to get my own price for what I was going to share with them. So I asked to be taken to the most expensive bar, and I ordered the most expensive Scotch whiskey, all debited to the account of the CIA. I then revealed to him that this particular sentence appears in the Vietnam News between Friday and Wednesday. That is, between the 2 Thursdays when the talks were held in the Hotel Majestic in Paris, the talks between the Vietnamese and the Americans, and that if the cutoff figure was 3, that if it appeared 3 times or less in the 5 days between the talks, it would mean that the Vietnamese were going to concede something. If it appeared more than 3 times, it meant that they'd be very, very tough again on the next Thursday. So that's my contribution to bringing about peace in North Vietnam. From there, I went on to a further posting in Brussels, where we used the media to push the problem of Indian ethnic foods, which were drastically affected by Britain joining the common market and on a number of other subjects. Then I fetched up in Karachi, where I had a lovely time with the press. The Pakistani press have always been kinder to me than the Indian press. And I did actually get a certificate of appreciation for my work in Karachi from India Today. So I can't say it's all been very bad. The result of this laudatory reference to me and my work in Karachi was that I was asked to become the spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs. And when I'd been there for about a year, I then asked that I might be shifted to a more substantive job. And it was Kotru who said to me in his farewell speech that he could have made a box item out of me on every single briefing that I gave. Fortunately, they were kind to me and allowed me to pass. And then I was the spokesman for the 7th Non-Aligned Summit, and I received considerable praise from the New Yorker. As a result of all this, I found that when Operation Blue Star took place, I was pulled out of the UN desk on which I was just beginning to cut my teeth and asked to join a group called the Special Publicity Group, whose job was to take journalists, particularly foreign journalists, every day on a shuttle run from Delhi to Amritsar, where they would be briefed, and I'd bring them back and go back again next day. And Mrs. Gandhi, with whom I had virtually nothing to do, learnt about what the work I was doing, and then punished me for my virtues. I was posted out to the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting with the ridiculous title of Information Advisor to the Information Minister. But happily, it didn't last too long, because perhaps unhappily, Mrs. Gandhi didn't last too long. Once she was assassinated, talk turned up of why I should be shifted from INB to PMO, and that's how I joined the Prime Minister's office in February, March of 1985, where between Rajiv and I, we decided to open up the Prime Minister's office to the media. We almost guaranteed access to the Prime Minister for any interview that any newspaper, and those days newspapers were the principal media, wanted, and took armies of them on trips that the Prime Minister made, particularly out of the country. But my predecessor, Mr. H.Y. Sharda Prasad, who was a much wiser person than I was, he totally objected to what we were doing. He said that this is demystifying the Prime Minister. And it turned out that he was absolutely right, because in return for this huge access, that unprecedented access that we'd given to the media, to the Prime Minister, we ended up with the media turning against him and discovering that whatever he had to say had already been printed elsewhere, and so there was not very much interest. Maybe we should have maintained the mystery of the Prime Minister's office, but anyway, in consequence of that, things started turning sour fairly early on. And then disaster struck. At least disaster struck me. Rajiv Gandhi went to Washington in June of 1985, carrying with him a very large media. But on arrival there, we found that the US protocol had decided that no more than 5 of these 100 journalists or so would be permitted to share a table at the banquet that Ronald Reagan was giving in honor of Mr. and Mrs. Rajiv Gandhi. And the question arose as to how do we choose 5 out of these Xenophon's 10,000 that were accompanying us to Washington. So I hit upon a formula. I really shouldn't have tried democratically to share this with my journalist friends. I hit upon a formula that if we took the 2 news agencies, the English news agency PTI and the Hindi news agency Bhasha, and put them in the banquet room, along with 1 Muslim, 1 Sikh, and 1 communist, it would be a fairly amusing guest list to present to the White House. But all those who didn't fall in any of these 5 categories decided to volubly protest. And the protests were going on in such a loud manner, without any kind of justification being given as to why they should be included and the ones I'd chosen should not be included, that I remarked, since after dinner there would be a violin concert, I said that if any of you were a music critic, I would find myself a criterion by which to include you. But as you are only common or garden reporters, I could see no reason whatsoever for us to not include the 5 already chosen. At which point the American lady who was the liaison officer from the US State Department, she butted into this briefing saying, "And they'll be dancing too," she said. At which point the Hindu reporter in Washington suddenly exploded like a volcano and said, "Why am I not included?" So I, witty me, I said, "Do you want to dance with Nancy Reagan?" And at that point, the coals came down upon my head. The Hindu had the first ever editorial on me, and with that began my descent into being the hate object of the media. I never ever recovered from Ram's editorial on the call. Anyway, his editorial colleagues' scathing criticism of this upstart press advisor that Rajiv Gandhi had acquired. And so over the next 4 years, again and again and again, I found myself under severe attack from every section of the media as the prize for having opened up the Prime Minister's office to the media as never before. And at that point, one of my few friends in the media, a young man of not much more than 30, Veer Sanghvi, who had begun editing Sunday magazine, he said to me, "You're just a lightning rod. Don't take it personally. All this is an attack on Rajiv Gandhi. And because they can't go on and on attacking Rajiv Gandhi, you're a convenient lightning rod that will take all these blows." And so I saved my self-respect and somehow soldiered on. Then came Bofors. And we had journalism converted into a crusade. Crusaders who saw themselves as kingmakers, whose goal was to somehow bring down Rajiv Gandhi and install one of the crusaders as an important minister in the VP Singh government. Now I'll need an entirely fresh and separate session, preferably a debate between N. Ram and myself, to get to the truth of the Bofors story. So this is obviously not the forum in which I could talk about all the many holes that could be pricked into this narrative being recounted by particularly Ram in the Hindu and Arun Shourie at the Indian Express. They were collaborating. They had a lady in Geneva called Chitra Subramaniam, and I'd be delighted if she's in the audience, but I don't think she is. And between the three of them, they tore into Rajiv, and they insisted that the man had somehow swiped 64 crore rupees from the Indian treasury in order to enrich themselves, and that in consequence we had been landed with a lemon and too much money had been paid out for it. The argument has persisted for decades after Rajiv Gandhi's own death. It's been through several courts. Nobody has been able to find anybody who went wrong, and my question has never been answered. And that question simply was this, that in Martin Ardbo's diary, and if I might remind the younger generation, Ardbo was the boss of the company that manufactured these Bofors guns. It was originally founded by Alfred Nobel, the warmonger, in whose name peace prizes are announced once a year. And if this year they give it to Donald Trump, as seems likely, then I think this would be a true tribute to the warmongering capacities of Alfred Nobel. Anyway, there was a diary of Martin Ardbo's in which all the key players were named with their initials. So we had R, which clearly stood for Rajiv Gandhi, and we had Q, which clearly stood for Patrocki. There was H, which clearly stood for Hinduja, And then there was N. And nobody sought to find out who was N. And in my view, N was the man who set up not a sting operation, but a scam. And that N was part of this group. He's no more, but I used to repeatedly mention him in my columns, Arun Nehru, and to my mind, it was he who set all this up. But it is the right of investigative journalists to follow their investigative trails, although I think journalism, to be fair, has not only to be investigative, but also to give equal opportunity to the other side. And it is that equal opportunity that I seek someday at a forum like this, where perhaps Ram and I could debate one of the key factors that led to the defeat of Rajiv Gandhi in November, December of 1989. I had just resigned from the Foreign Service at that time. I was without an income. It happens again and again in my life. But I was invited by the same Veer Sanghvi to write one column, and I was very, very reluctant to do it. But he persuaded me to write one column on the outcome of the election in the very week that Rajiv Gandhi had been crushingly defeated, the number of his seats falling from well over 400 to under 200. In that column, I suggested that since VP Singh's was a minority government, he was really like a cripple with two unequal crutches, because he couldn't survive as a government without support both from the left, the communists, and from the right, the BJP. So I said, how long will this last? My original text said 1 week, and then Montek Singh Ahluwalia insisted on changing it to a short time. And so that one guest column was published, and my future was made, because it received more hate letters than Sunday Magazine had ever received in all its journalistic life. There were hundreds of abusive letters that poured in because the media as such was so thrilled with the election outcome that they thought this VP Singh has come as the great rescuer, and good riddance to this awful Prime Minister and his government who were involved up to their necks in the most vicious, slimy corruption that the nation had ever seen. And so I had written my cynical piece about VP Singh at a time when the Statesman, on the 1st of December 1989, gushed, thank God it's VP Singh. He is the obvious choice. He only deserves it. Then we had Tavleen Singh, whom I called Tavleen Gush Gush Singh, who said, VP Singh brings to his office the scent of the dust of India's villages. Long may it linger. And we had in Sunday Magazine, the same one that is publishing my column, saying, watch out for VP Singh. He's going to be around for a long, long time. He lasted 10 months. I, in this atmosphere, produced my first column. And several of my colleagues said to me, as I wrote column after column in that first month, they know, why are you displaying your sour grapes? In an election, you won in 1984, you lost in 1989. Can't you behave yourself? And when I remarked about an article written by Chidambaram on Kashmir, that it was an extremely well-written article, my wife said to me, why can't you write like Chidambaram? And we had the only quarrel we've ever had in 45 years of getting married. I was appalled at the suggestion that I should write like Chidambaram. But then came Veer to my rescue. He said, hang on. Veer said to me, hang on, you'll be proved right. And since in the meanwhile, Sunday had decided to pay me enough for my columns for me to have the same pay as I'd had as the Joint Secretary, I hung on for pure economic reasons. But while I was hanging on and making my criticisms, the press was still full of Mr. VP Singh. We had Indranil Banerjee and Rajiv Shukla, who's now become a very prominent congressman, but at that time was a journalist. Indranil Banerjee and Rajiv Shukla writing in Sunday on the 21st of January 1990, that is about 6 weeks after VP Singh had become PM. VP Singh has already proved one thing, his capacity for conjuring miracles. He's seen as a man who keeps his pledges and is endowed with an indefatigable sense of purpose. Then we had this little bit of genius from Indrajit Badwar and Prabhu Chawla in India Today of the 15th of June 1990, when VP Singh had been in office for about 6 months. It said, the real Raja has begun not only to stand up, but also to stand out. A ruthless tactician and a man capable of rolling endlessly with punches. But most of all, as a man who knows how to play with men. India Today, 15th June 1990. The clock has already begun to tick. And then Pritish Nandi, in the Illustrated Weekly of India, 11th March 1990. Much as M.J. Akbar, the same man who's now on the other side, but he said, much as M.J. Akbar might vouch for Rajiv's sagacity, and Shankar Aiyar sing hosannas to the man, there are not many who believe Rajiv has the skill or the acumen to maneuver himself back to the center stage of national politics. So what could I do? There I was, faced with a phalanx of the most prominent journalists in India, saying that the new Prime Minister was a wonderful man who'd be with us, watch out for him for a long, long time to come. And there I was, pitting myself against the entire phalanx. It was then that Veer said to me, writing well is the best revenge. I don't think it was an original of his. I think he was quoting somebody else. But that's what decided me that I would continue writing. So I decided to take on Pritish Nandi, who was the last person I quoted a minute or so ago. I published my reply to his article on 27 May on the 10th of June. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I just like to spend a little time on explaining why I think writing well is the best revenge when you're caught up in a corner. And you will be able to judge whether I was indeed writing well or simply being as abusive of Pritish Nandi as he had been of the Chief Minister of Odisha, Mr. J.B. Patnaik. Pritish Nandi's argument in the Illustrated Weekly of India portrayed himself and his correspondence. I'm now quoting myself, unforgivable, but that's all I can do today. Portrayed himself and his colleagues as a band of peerless journalists, fearless, upright, honest, persecuted by a grubby politician, a sexual pervert and megalomaniac who would resort to any trick, however mean, however low, however demeaning, to curb the freedom of the press. What was this based on? It is based on the fact that some raids had taken place on J.B. Patnaik's home and office. And then said Nandi, these have reportedly. Now the minute I see a word like reportedly, I know that the general is CYA, which I will translate as covering himself. He's covering himself because he's not asserting that he is saying this. Somebody's report is there, so he uses the word reportedly. So Nandi said that these reports have reportedly uncovered cash, ornaments, and undeclared assets running into crores of rupees. At this point, J.B. Patnaik sent a letter to Prime Minister V.P. Singh, in which he said, the following is my list of assets. I have 1.5 lakh in bank deposits, a DDA flat valued at 3 lakh, those were happy innocent days, and investment in an orchard of 8 lakh. That's all he said his assets were. So where were Nandi's crores of rupees? He then went on to say, by using the word reportedly covering himself up, that this, I said, was a typical example of Pritish Nandi's penchant for suggestio falsi. That is the construction of sentences which in some technical sense say one thing but are expressly designed to plant something quite different in the reader's mind. And this is a technique so often resorted to that I'm wanting to warn my young friends who have come here for this convocation to not use words like reportedly. Either it's true or it isn't true. And if you believe it to be true, I think you should come out and say so. Then he wrote up this article. And in that article, after writing it, I received a call, a trunk call. In those days, when an intercity call was made, it was described as a trunk call, not a call. The age of the mobile was still not upon us. I received a trunk call from Pritish Nandi. He was beside himself with excitement, cackling, sniggering, expostulating, expletives deleted. He asked whether I'd read the latest weekly. I told him that as I was a literate person of delicate sensibilities and some refinement of taste, I did not usually read the Illustrated Weekly. Oh, he begged me to see this issue. It was a real scorcher, he said. He'd really socked it to the bastard. I promised I would. Before ringing off, Pritish asked me solicitously, "And how are you, my dear friend?" And I replied, "Since I am 500 miles from your peephole, I am very well indeed, thank you." Then, taking care to see that the children were asleep, the doors firmly locked, the curtains pulled, I took out the famous issue of the Illustrated Weekly, which talked of J.B. Patnaik. I unwrapped its brown paper covering and threw myself full frontal upon what must rank as the most scatological example of salacious sensationalism ever thrown at an unsuspecting public by the old lady of Boribanda, which was how the Times of India group was known. What the piece said was written by one S.N.M. Abdi, who was the Illustrated Weekly's correspondent in Bhubaneswar. He wrote, "One hears plenty of stories about Patnaik, stories of his alleged," please note that word, it covers him, stories about his alleged libidinal involvement with a series of women, full stop, and men, full stop. He then proceeded to substantiate the allegations with 3 specific cases. First, the testimony of a young man whose identity was stated to be Raju Jaina. That was the name given of the man. The second was a woman called Sheborani Das. And the third was described as a young widow who had received, whose father had received favors from Patnaik, that's Janaki Vallabh Patnaik, in exchange for favors granted to Patnaik by the man's daughter. She was described as the young widow. Then it turned out that Raju Jaina's words were not his own. What the writer, the correspondent, had done was to, as Abdi himself said, sum up the story that he'd heard from Raju Jaina in his own words. And then, as he said, Raju Jaina was described as a kind of boyfriend of J.B. Patnaik in the most outrageous language and with the most terrible innuendos. Then another journalist came up, Farzan Ahmed of India Today. He tracked down this so-called Raju Jaina, and it turned out that Raju Jaina was a bogus name. And the real Raju Jaina was a man called Vishwanath Sethi of Balipatna village in Puri district. And what Vishwanath Sethi did was to say that it was in aid of Biju Patnaik, that is the man who had been defeated by Janaki Vallabh, of Biju Patnaik, who had been taken to see J.B. Patnaik, and there they met up, they had a conversation. And then he says that it was, according to Abdi, his conversation with Jaina had been tape recorded, but the tape recorder was not produced. And therefore, Sethi found that it was actually a scam set up by Biju Patnaik, and that there was absolutely nothing wrong that J.B. Patnaik had done with this young man. Then next came the woman. Abdi, that is the Illustrated Weekly's representative, had claimed that detailed documentary evidence exists in at least one case involving Patnaik with a woman called Sheborani Das. I quote, "Then it turned out that the documentary evidence was a letter from the manager of a Bhubaneswar government guest house who was complaining that this Sheborani Das had been staying in the guest house for 52 days. And whenever she was asked to pay her bill, she would say, please send it to the chief minister, and wouldn't pay the bill. So then, nothing had been said about what was wrong. Finally, this Sheborani Das gave an interview in which Abdi himself asked her whether the chief minister had ever visited her in these 52 days in the guest house. To which Sheborani replied, never. He is a saint. He took pity on this poor woman. The third case was of the young widow. Then it turned out, when Farzan went and tracked her down, that her name was Suktani Hota of Jharsuguda. And it was said that she had complained about Janaki Vallabh's behavior in a letter to Sonia Gandhi, and that they produced this letter. Suktani Hota said she issued a statement saying, quote, she was being unnecessarily dragged into the controversy and denying that she had written to Sonia Gandhi complaining against Patnaik. Of course, at that time, J.B. Patnaik made a huge mistake. He had his police seize all available copies of the Illustrated Weekly of India that carried the story. Farzan Ahmad discovered that the total circulation of the Illustrated Weekly in Orissa was 2,500. But after these 2,500 copies had been seized, 10,000 additional copies had been printed in Bombay and sent into Orissa. So in fact, 4 times more of this issue, full of a tissue of lies, were issued. Then Patnaik decided to strike back and sued Pritish Nandi. The minute Pritish Nandi came to learn of this, he found that, I'm now quoting from myself, when he found that bluster would not ease him out of a jam, he came whining and whinnying to me. He pleaded that he had been out of India at the time the article had been published, and I must do something to save him from bankruptcy, prison, or worse. And the same man, I had him come home. We sat down and tried several different drafts to see what is the form of the apology that he could put in to get himself saved from bankruptcy, prison, or worse. But he wouldn't accept the word apology. That word he wouldn't use. And my senior in PMO, Gopi Arora, said that nothing could be compromised if he didn't apologize. And so the case continued. I don't know what the outcome is. To go by what Ram has said, from 1992 onwards, all such cases never reach a conclusion. So I presume this one also never reached a conclusion. But how did this Pritish Nandi, having come to my home, fallen on my knees, asked me to help him draft some kind of a letter that would get him off the hook, how did he react? He said, those were terrible years of J.B. Patnaik's misrule, while people like Shankar Aiyar stood on the sidelines and cheered enthusiastically. And then he went on to say that I had waxed eloquent on J.B. Patnaik's greatness. Then says Pritish Nandi, I laughed. What can one tell a silly man who shuts his eyes and then complains that the world is black? This is Pritish Nandi on yours truly. So I wrote, I did not complain that the world is black. I do complain about editors who are blackguards. And then Pritish Nandi ended with advisors like Aiyar. Does Rajiv Gandhi really need enemies? I responded, with blackguards like Nandi, does VP Singh really need Pichu Patnaik? This is the way in which one has to fight them from within. That is why it is not enough to remain a quiescent, passive target of motivated journalism. The only way in which one can get one's own back is to become one of them. If you can't lick them, join them. And that's how I became a columnist myself. It was the only way in which I could protect myself for the sin of having become a politician. Now, of course, I'm not even that, for I've been suspended from my party. So I suppose, being totally unemployed, I can perhaps be discussed as a sometime journalist. Anyway, that's where we stand. But fortunately for me, soon after this big battle between Nandi and myself, I started gaining credence. And those who had praised VP Singh to the skies, they began to be challenged. And my favorite was a piece by Cho in Tughlaq, 15th June 1990. Strange, he wrote in Tamil, are the ways of the national press. The Fourth Estate is busy lavishing praise on the Prime Minister, that is Prime Minister VP Singh. The trouble is that the Prime Minister has not given any ground for that praise. So, the press has resorted to congratulating the man merely for continuing in office. For, he adds, after all, VP Singh is the print media's Prime Minister. I had a strong suspicion then that Cho was looking directly at Ram as he wrote that sentence. Then came the Tribune, Chandigarh, 24th October 1990. By this time, the anger against VP Singh was boiling up. And it said it will be unfortunate if Mr. VP Singh is thrown out of office, but if he survives, it will be a calamity. And then on the 8th of November 1990, VP Singh lost the motion of no confidence and resigned 2 days later. And I wrote my shortest column ever, just 4 words, I told you so. So, if you can get into their ranks, become one of them, then perhaps you can attempt at least, if not succeed, to get back your own. For it is not true that investigative journalism is always in the interest of the truth. If the journalist gets caught up in his own story, if he becomes a principal actor in the story, then if he becomes partisan, if he wishes to prove his point, if he insists on being a kingmaker rather than a journalist, then I think there is a serious pitfall ahead. For even as being a politician, I tried to become a journalist, there is the other danger of the journalist attempting to become the politician. And while you hear a great deal about the need to preserve the freedom of the press, and I would be second to none in wanting to endorse that point of view, the fact is that we seem to have moved very far away from the happy old days of a constructive relationship between the political establishment and the media establishment. I think it's extremely important for us to remember that politicians need the oxygen of publicity, and journalists need politicians to write about. And that it is this interaction between those who are using the powers of their office and those who are exercising their constitutional right to freedom of expression that determines the manner in which democracy gets constructed and moves forward. In what I call the happy old days, which was about the time my younger brother, who has gone on to become among the best known journalists in India, Swaminathan, about the time that he joined, the newspapers used to send their brightest and the best as the first assignment to cover Parliament. Parliament was regarded as the shrine of democracy, and newspapers attempting to pay homage to this shrine of democracy would take care to report what was happening in Parliament. Some papers would follow the London Times in even reserving an entire page for top-class writing, often satirical writing, which would seriously take up and then perhaps seriously tear to shreds the arguments used on the floor of the House, the phrases used on the floor of the House, the direction in which the debate was moving. And therefore, we used to have a very, very well-disciplined Parliament. It was a forum for discussion and not what it has now become, a forum for demonstration. My own very first exposure to Parliament was in, if my memory is right, February of 1960, just after Jawaharlal Nehru had dismissed the first ever democratically elected communist government in the state of Kerala, which had E.M.S. Namboodiripal as the chief minister. It was Indira Gandhi who had led that movement, and Nehru had acquiesced, very possibly against his own best instinct, and dismissed under Article 356 the duly elected communist government of Kerala and installed President's rule. Some friend of mine in college got us a pass, and I went in. And in those days, you weren't restricted to an hour in the visitors' gallery. You could sit as long as you wished. And I saw Comrade Dange get to his feet, with Nehru sitting immediately opposite him, within the distance of a sword. And he launched himself upon Jawaharlal Nehru. He damned him and condemned him for his undemocratic behavior. And the climax came when, referring to the story of Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata, Comrade Dange said that, like Yudhishthira, your chariot, he said to Nehru, would ride a few inches above the ground, because everyone knew that whatever you said was the truth. But then, as in the case of Yudhishthira, after they killed an elephant whose name was Ashwathama, which also happened to be the name of the son of Dronacharya, who was the most important military advisor on the other side, they then forced Yudhishthira to call out, Ashwathama ataha. That is, Ashwathama is dead. And then sotto voce, he said, Kujaraha. That is, the elephant called Ashwathama is dead. And said Dange, at that moment, Yudhishthira's chariot fell to the ground, just as at the moment you dismissed the Kerala government, your chariot has fallen to the ground. Pin drop silence in the Congress side. Everyone listening to this bitter condemnation. Nehru himself taking it on the jaw. That was democracy at its best. And there was the press in the galleries, covering every word of what was said and reporting it faithfully next day. By the time I got into Parliament, which was a good 30 years later, things had already begun to sour. But progressively, over the decade of the 90s, I found, number one, that the best and the brightest were not being sent anymore by editors to cover Parliament. What was worse, what happened in Parliament was not reported except when something went seriously wrong. Absolutely splashed over the front pages of every newspaper in delightfully constructed boxes was when Uma Bharati accused me of having made an obscene gesture in her direction. We had a lady communist member who was chairing the session at that time, Malini Chatterjee, and she said, "But I saw nothing." At which point, the gesture again, and Uma Bharati went completely hysterical, and I found myself all over the papers. But all those wonderful speeches that I had made on all kinds of matters of national importance, would they get in? Not a hope in hell. You cause disruption and you find yourself a national figure. You make a constructive contribution and you're very lucky if you even get relegated to the back pages with 1.5 sentences. And then it got reflected in the press gallery. As soon as there was to be a hangama, a huge shouting tumult in the House, the press galleries would be full. The minute the House came into order, the press galleries would empty. And so, finding that publicity, which is the oxygen of politics, was not available for discussion on the floor of the House, whereas demonstrations on the floor of the House would immediately attract a great deal of media attention. Over the last 30 years, or nearly 30 years, that I've been associated with Parliament, I've seen Parliament go from bad to worse and worse still. Today, democracy is at serious danger because we do not have the right kind of relationship between the media and politicians. It's not that there aren't many other causes for this, but were there to be restored a relationship of respect and responsibility between the press and the politician, perhaps that would make the politician behave better than he does now. Because the press does not behave fairly and squarely with the politician then does the one thing that will enable him to find his place on television screens and in the newspapers. So, I would suggest that there are 3 or 4 things that need to be corrected. Number 1, bylines. Giving bylines is a matter of routine to journalists for the most ordinary kind of reports makes every journalist a publicity seeker himself. I have a little story in this regard. Some of the older members of this audience would remember a demonstration by naked sadhus wielding trishuls that took place on Parliament Street in November 1966. As a result of this unprecedented violence and violence-prone demonstration, the regular reporters who had been assigned to cover this parade, just 5 minutes. The regular reporters who had been assigned to cover this ghastly parade were unable to reach the venue. So my brother, who'd been a newspaper correspondent for about a year at that time, and was covering Parliament at that stage, as was standard practice for bright young journalists to be trained in journalism, when he got back to the office, Nandan Kargal and Mungalkar were in a panic because this key story could not be covered by the correspondents who had been sent out to cover it. And my brother said that as he was covering Parliament, and Parliament was not in session, he stood on the balcony of Parliament House and watched the whole demonstration on Parliament Street. So with no alternative, they asked him to get into his cabin and write up the story. And as page by page he wrote it, it was carried to the editors who were looking at it and going through it. And when he finished and came out, they said this is a truly outstanding piece of reporting and we must give you a special prize for that. So he thought he was going to get some money. What they said to him is, your prize is a byline. It was something that was awarded for exceptional performance. Now it's become totally routine, and that makes every story that person's story. So willy-nilly, he becomes an actor in his own story. Then we have this terrible business of breaking news. It's now reached mania proportions, manic proportions. If everyone is competing with everybody else to put out the story before it has been checked, before it has been analyzed, before it has been synthesized with other facts and put out in a sober way, what you get is trivialization, sensationalization, and worst of all, commercialization. Because news and comment, through this practice of beating the deadline, breaking news, becomes a commodity which is measured in terms of TRPs. The Goswami syndrome, as I call it, makes reporters and anchors, especially on television, actors in their own stories. And the anchors, in particular, find that they can catch eyeballs, which is the expression they use, through extreme partisanship. This is journalism as pamphleteering. And the old, perhaps out of date, C.P. Scott maxim that facts are sacred, comment is free, gets thrown to one side, and facts are supposed to increase TRPs. And I knew that the Congress government was going to collapse. I'm talking of UPA 2, when I returned home one evening and found my wife sitting in front of the television set, looking utterly miserable. So I said to her, but Sunit, what's happened? And she said, no scams today. That's what we've reduced television to. We have a scam a day. And then this Goswami syndrome manifests itself in the building of a personality cult. The story is never about the story. The story is about the anchor. And then this horrible practice of snipping. Take a phrase, cut out the words that explain some expression, and then damn the person for it. And repeatedly, I find myself the victim of that. I was recently in Pakistan, and I said, I love Pakistan because I love India. And I wanted to explain, and I did go on to explain, that I think the integration of the Indian Muslim community with the totality of India's modern nationhood is our single biggest challenge. But so long as we have a hostile relationship with Pakistan, there will be a tendency for extremist Indians to suggest a salience between Muslim and Pakistani. Which is why Amir Ali Khan is told go to Pakistan, Salman Khan is told go to Pakistan, Saif Ali Khan is told go to Pakistan. Why does no one say go to Indonesia? Or say go to Saudi Arabia? Or even go to Bangladesh? Why go to Pakistan? Because we've so assiduously cultivated Pakistan as the word that covers up anti-Muslim feelings. And therefore I want my India to be a plural India. And I don't think we can survive as a plural democratic country unless we are able to bring some kind of reason and rationality into our relationship with them. So my final word is, freedom of expression is not only a constitutional right, it is also a constitutional duty, especially for journalists, editors, and anchors who exercise that right every day and therefore have that duty laid on them also every day. Freedom of expression is too precious to be sold down the river for mere commercial gain. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, all of you, for listening to me so patiently. Jai Hind.